The war with Iran has finally arrived, and what I'm going to share with you today could change everything you know about this conflict. Welcome back to Access of Truth on JNS. It's been a historic weekend, and today, from the bomb shelter, I want to give you an inside look at why exactly dealing with the Islamic regime in Iran and supporting a regime change is strictly in American interests. Because there's a growing narrative in parts of Washington and across media platforms that Iran is someone else's problem. It's Israel's issue, it's a regional issue, it doesn't concern us. But this is factually, intellectually, and morally false. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has defined itself in opposition to the United States, not only rhetorically, but operationally. This regime has killed hundreds of American service members. It's financed attacks that targeted American embassies. It's plotted assassinations on U.S. soil. It's attempted kidnappings of American citizens. It's directly fired ballistic missiles at American troops for decades. It's orchestrated terror attacks against Americans, and it's been developing ICBMs and nuclear proliferation to create a bomb, all while swearing to wipe America off the map. Now, that's not a distant regional dispute. It's a documented pattern of active hostility directed at the United States. So when you hear people say this doesn't concern Americans, understand what they're asking you to ignore. They're asking you to ignore more than 880 dead Americans, to ignore dead Marines in Beirut, to ignore the attempted murder of U.S. officials, including the president himself. Does that sound like America first to you? Or more accurately, does tolerating such attacks from the Islamic regime sound like a forever war? Or does taking decisive action to end the threat actually prevent that forever war? Because once you lay out the chronology year by year, decade by decade, what emerges here is not a misunderstanding, but a sustained campaign against the United States and a regime that has never abandoned its core ideological objective to destroy America. Let's start by looking at the record. 1979, after a violent coup to overthrow the Shah, Islamic revolutionaries seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. This wasn't rogue behavior for the regime. It was foundational behavior for their ideology. The new regime consolidated power through anti-Americanism as a core value, which is why they literally have a museum dedicated to the evils of the United States. Can you imagine if we had an entire state-funded museum dedicated to how evil Iran was? Whether we understand it or not in the U.S., death to America, it isn't a fringe chant. It's institutional language that defined the revolution's identity. Then comes the 1980s. In 1983, the U.S. embassy in Beirut was bombed. Later that year, the Marine barracks were bombed. Both attacks carried out by the Islamic regime created and funded terror group Hezbollah. And this is where the proxy architecture begins to take permanent shape. The regime doesn't always fire weapons directly. They build networks that do, from criminal gangs to cartels to Islamist terror groups like Hezbollah all over the world. And they do this since their inception. That's why the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, along with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, was a close ally of Ayatollah Khomeini when he was in exile in Lebanon plotting the revolution of '79. It's also the reason why we saw PLO terrorists on the ground inside of Iran during that revolution itself in 1979. Now, fast forward to the 1990s. In 1996, the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia killed 19 American servicemen. A U.S. federal court later found the Islamic Republic of Iran responsible, which matters because it establishes a legal record of state-backed proxy terrorism resulting in American deaths. And then comes Iraq. After 2003, as U.S. forces were operating in Iraq, Islamic regime-backed militias introduced new roadside bombs, IEDs, that U.S. officials confirmed were supplied or facilitated by the regime in Iran. In fact, the Pentagon has acknowledged that hundreds of U.S. service members were killed by Islamic regime-backed forces in Iraq alone. Now move forward to 2011. The U.S. Department of Justice charged individuals in a plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C., in a scheme tied to elements of the IRGC, all on U.S. soil. Now, mind you, we aren't even getting to the list of attacks the regime has orchestrated in other countries, from the UK to Argentina and beyond, or the constant cyber attacks and subversion efforts that the regime has been conducting for decades in the US. Did you forget that the US Intel assessment stated that the regime was at least in part behind funding for US anti Israel campus protests after October 7th? But back to the timeline. In 2020, the regime launched ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in the Al-Assad air base in Iraq. 2021, the Department of Justice charged Iranian intelligence officials in a kidnapping conspiracy targeting a U.S.-based journalist. The plan involved forcibly taking her out of the United States and kidnapping her to Iran to face certain death. In 2024, federal indictments described murder-for-hire plots linked to the IRGC targeting U.S. officials, including U.S. President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, in early 2026, regime state media aired content openly threatening President Trump once again with a comment about how the bullet won't miss this time. Now let's layer in the nuclear file in this timeline. For years, the debate was supposedly over whether the regime was pursuing weapons capability or merely civilian nuclear infrastructure. But by mid-2025, the IAEA reported that Iran possessed more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to 60% purity. Weapons grade, 90%. That enrichment is far beyond any civilian purpose. At the same time, the regime restricted IAEA access and monitoring in key areas, creating verification gaps that the agency itself has repeatedly warned about. Meanwhile, senior U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have publicly stated that the regime is developing intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities and rebuilding their nuclear program efforts, which the U.S. targeted in June last year. But let's look at the regional footprint. The regime has embedded itself in Iraq through militias such as Kataib Hezbollah and the Popular Mobilization Forces. In Syria, the IRGC and affiliated forces operated alongside Assad's regime and used the country to build those military bases on Israel's border. They also smuggled weapons and funds to terror groups in the region through their basically colonization and occupation efforts in Syria. Now, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, entirely created by the regime, functions as a state within a state and prevents a future peaceful Lebanon, which we would love to see as Israelis. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the Houthi terrorists have targeted American and British ships and have taken hostages. They've also disrupted regional and international shipping, risking American lives at sea and increasing costs for everyday Americans. In Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad both have received funding, training, and weapons from the regime. Weapons which were used on October 7th to kill 40 American citizens and kidnap 12 more. Now, the domestic front and the human rights atrocities also deserves an important mention. In 1988, there was a prison massacre which resulted in the execution of thousands of Iranian political prisoners. Over decades, the regime has executed tens of thousands more. There's also codified and enforced legal discrimination against women, mandatory hijab laws, which we've all heard about, but also unequal inheritance statutes, unequal testimony weight, and no rights for divorce, marriage, and other family issues. Now, if that's not enough, human rights organizations have also documented the extensive sexual violence used against arrested protesters, including the most recent crackdown against men, women, and even minors. In fact, the regime has a habit of targeting children. Beginning in late 2022, waves of poisonings affected thousands of schoolgirls in Iran to prevent them from protesting against the regime. They've also repeatedly carried out violence in order to present false flag attacks, thinking that it will somehow rally domestic support inside of Iran. In the 1980s, they blew up Cinema Rex in an attempt to frame others. In 2020, following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the regime shot down a civilian airliner, PS-752, killing 176 people, thinking they'd be able to blame the United States. The regime initially denied responsibility before later acknowledging that they made a mistake. But no Iranians, of course, actually believe them. That's why they've been calling out the regime in recent weeks alone for using schools and hospitals to carry out military activities, knowingly endangering civilian populations. But finally, Let's consider the financial architecture here. The regime has funneled billions of dollars to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis as their own currency is in free fall and they can't provide the bare minimum in a resource rich country. Instead of prioritizing the Iranian people or even mutually beneficial trade agreements, they use sanctions evasion networks to secure assets abroad exclusively for regime insiders. Their proxies, no different. Hezbollah's financial networks have operated in Latin America and even in the Western Hemisphere, engaging in documented criminal finance schemes to fund operations that can threaten the United States directly. So when people say this isn't America's war, the question in response should be, then whose war is it? At some point, the argument that this is not our fight collapses under the weight of a 47-year record. Because the Islamic Republic hasn't moderated, it has adapted. It's refined proxy warfare. It's refined sanctions evasions. It's refined intimidation abroad and repression at home. Now, you can debate about the how and when, but you can't debate the record. But let's move from that record to the outcome. What does the United States gain if this regime falls and a free Iran replaces it? Well, there's a lot of things, but I'm going to break them down for you one by one, at least a few of them for purposes of this episode. First, the collapse of proxy architecture. Hezbollah does not sustain itself without Tehran. The Houthis don't field advanced capabilities without Tehran. Hamas doesn't receive sustained funding and weapons pipelines without Tehran. The entire regional pressure system that has targeted U.S. troops, U.S. allies, and destabilized shipping lanes depends on a regime in Tehran that sees proxy warfare as doctrine. Remove that ideological sponsor, and the entire structure weakens. The second thing is energy markets. Iran possesses one of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet. Under sanctions and ideological isolation, that capacity remains constrained. But a normalized, economically integrated Iran would bring substantial supply to global markets and reduce dependence on nations like Russia. More supply lowers geopolitical risk premiums and reduces leverage for Moscow. Third, the cost of containment. For 4 decades, the United States has maintained a military footprint in the Middle East designed in part to deter and contain this regime's expansionism. Carrier strike groups, missile defense systems, base infrastructure, force rotations, these are not abstract concepts. It's taxpayer money that's needed to advance those American interests and protect American lives. But a non-hostile Iran alters that calculus dramatically. It doesn't eliminate the need for a U.S. presence overnight, but it does reduce the requirement for permanent high-alert containment architecture and opens the door to a new era of peace and prosperity in the entire region. Fourth, nuclear proliferation. A nuclear threshold Iran pressures Saudi Arabia. It pressures Turkey. It pressures Egypt. Regional proliferation cascades don't just happen in isolation. If the Islamic regime were eliminated, the pressure for a regional arms race massively decreases, which is a good thing for everybody. Fifth, economic integration and market opportunity. Iran's a country of nearly 90 million people, highly educated, technologically capable, geographically central. A transition would open one of the last major untapped markets in the region and the largest single market in the region. Infrastructure, aviation, telecommunications, energy modernization, technology, consumer goods. This isn't about exploitation. It's about normalizing fair trade. The sixth thing is strategic realignment, which I kind of alluded to earlier, but it's super important. The current regime has deepened its ties with Moscow and Beijing. Drone transfers to Russia, strategic agreements with China, energy and military cooperation. A post-ideological Iran wouldn't automatically become pro-American necessarily, but it would no longer be structurally aligned against the United States as part of an authoritarian bloc. Seventh, internal legitimacy. The Iranian population has repeatedly demonstrated dissent from the student protests to the Green Movement to women life freedom to today. A government that reflects its people rather than suppresses them alters the internal stability equation. If the United States benefits when major regional powers are internally legitimate rather than perpetually brittle and violent, that's a good thing for everyone. Now, none of this guarantees a perfect transition, But what is clear is this: the current regime exports proxy warfare, drives nuclear risk, drains American resources, and strengthens Russia and China. A different structure in Tehran changes those incentives entirely. So when critics ask, what does America gain? The answer is straightforward. America gains reduced security pressure on its troops and allies. America gains reduced security pressure on its troops and allies. America gains greater energy and market stability. America gains strategic breathing room with less proliferation risk and more authoritarian alignment against us. Remember, the status quo isn't cost-free, it's compounding. And the real question is not whether change carries risk, it's whether the current trajectory carries more. So does it? Let's debunk the most common response that we hear to the idea of regime change in Iran. Now, another Iraq is what we keep hearing. For many Americans, that phrase isn't just a policy argument, it's a memory. A 4,000 plus American service members killed memory. It's tens of thousands wounded. It's trillions of taxpayer dollars spent. It's intelligence failures and broken public trust. So when Americans hear the word regime change, they don't hear strategy, they hear cost. And the reaction isn't irrational, it's informed by experience. But serious national analysis can't end with emotional shorthand. Because the real question facing the U.S. is not whether intervention carries risk, it's whether the alternative, allowing a nuclear threshold regime that has already killed American troops and plotted violence on U.S. soil to consolidate power indefinitely, carries less risk. Let's remember that American troops are stationed in Iraq, Syria, and throughout the Gulf states. These forces have already been targeted by regime-backed militias. When the Houthis attack international shipping, global supply chains are disrupted. Energy markets also disrupted, and Americans feel it at the pump. When the regime advances its uranium enrichment to 60% purity and restricts monitoring, a regime with a documented record of hostility towards the U.S. moves closer to nuclear breakout capability. When federal indictments describe IRGC-linked assassination plots inside the United States, the security of everyday Americans is threatened on our own soil. So let's distinguish this clearly. Iraq in 2003 was a U.S.-led invasion of a largely contained dictatorship. The United States dismantled the governing structure and attempted to construct a new political order while simultaneously fighting a multi-sided insurgency. It was a maximalist intervention, but that model is not the only model available in history. Eastern Europe in 1989 didn't require the United States to invade and rebuild countries from the ground up. In Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Soviet-backed communist regimes fell because of massive internal protests combined with steady Western pressure, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and yes, military deterrence. The fall of the Berlin Wall meant American troops in Europe no longer had to prepare for a massive war with Soviet tank divisions rolling across Germany. It reduced the risk of nuclear confrontation that had hung over U.S. security policy for decades. Over time, countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, and others joined NATO, which expanded America's alliances and strengthened its defensive position in Europe. These countries also shifted to market economies, which meant new trading partners and new opportunities for American businesses. In Asia, South Korea and Taiwan also transitioned over time from authoritarian systems into democratic allies that are now pillars of U.S. economic and security architecture. And yes, there are also examples of regime change achieved through military force that ultimately strengthened American security and interests abroad. The defeat of Nazi Germany led to the creation of a democratic West Germany, ultimately, that became one of America's closest allies and the economic engine of Europe. The defeat of Imperial Japan resulted in a democratic Japan that is now one of the United States' strongest security partners in Asia and one of the world's largest economies. Those transformations required force and rebuilding. But the result wasn't endless instability and forever wars. It was two of the most stable, prosperous, democratic allies in the modern world. Different cases, different methods. But the point is simple. Not every regime change ends in disaster. Some reshape the global balance of power in ways that dramatically improve America's long-term security and prosperity. The "another Iraq" argument rests on an assumption that doing nothing carries zero cost, and that assumption is categorically false. The cost of Iraq is well documented, but so is the cost of 4 decades of Iranian proxy warfare, maritime disruption, regional destabilization, assassination plots, and nuclear proliferation. Unlike Iraq in 2003, Iran today is already deeply integrated into regional conflicts. Iran is an epicenter of active transnational influence, from Lebanon to Yemen to Syria to Iraq to Gaza, even to Venezuela and the UK. The instability argument cuts both ways. You can't argue that removing the regime risks instability while simultaneously ignoring that the regime itself is a primary engine of regional instability. Now, it's true that history punishes reckless intervention, but history also punished the prolonged dismissal of accumulating threat. Americans learned that lesson on September 11th when a threat that had been growing in plain sight was underestimated until it was catastrophic. Which brings us to the Iranian case today. Iran isn't an artificial colonial construct. It's not an Arab country with a history of Islamist extremism either. It's an ancient nation state with a strong national identity that's frankly been colonized by Islam. It's a state with high literacy rates, a technologically sophisticated population, and decades of documented internal opposition seeking democracy and human rights. Unlike Iraq, there is already a transition framework that's being proposed by opposition leader Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, whom the highest number of Iranians, by a long shot, are calling for to lead a transition government. His plan outlines phased approaches specifically designed to avoid institutional collapse and chaos. Another Iraq. So the real question is not, could there be risk? It's whether the long-term risk of a nuclear threshold ideologically expansionist regime outweighs the transitional risk of political change. And the answer is no. Well, our good, bad, and ugly stories will be short this week, and as always, we'll be reversing the order to end on a positive note. So first things first, the insane, ugly propaganda war that we're seeing right now. Right now, there's quite the scandal as the Islamic regime attempts to do really anything to distract from their failures following those U.S. and Israeli airstrikes that took out, well, almost everyone in their leadership. So what do? Distract. The regime has made the grandiose claim that the U.S. or Israel attacked a girls' school in Minab, Iran, and killed more than 140 young girls. Now, aside from the fact that this is being exclusively reported by the Islamic Republic state media, something about this story is off from the get-go. First, the geographic location of the alleged school is not only adjacent to an IRGC base, but within the base itself. Add on to that there's zero evidence the school itself was targeted, and it makes complete sense why targeting an IRGC base would result in damage to a school nearby. But the biggest question here isn't even whether a strike occurred or not. And by the way, I personally investigated this and confirmed with the IDF that they had no part in this particular strike whatsoever. But why is there a little girls' school within an IRGC base in the first place? This alone is arguably a war crime, especially if the presence of civilians on the base was to disguise military activities. And of course, targeting a base is totally legitimate under international law. Meanwhile, this case, without any evidence or the names of the allegedly slain children, is making the rounds with all the usual suspects in media, who happen to be affiliated with the regime or other anti-American causes. So I spoke with residents of Minab myself, who were able to get internet access briefly on Saturday. And they told me they weren't even aware of such a school existing and don't know anyone who attends this place. They'd never heard of it and didn't know when it was established. One of my sources also claimed that the community believes there are missile depots under the base itself, which could compound any military action with secondary explosions if it did indeed take place. The truth is, we don't yet know the details of this case, and any loss of civilian life is a tragedy. But we do know that the Islamic Republic is trying very, very hard to present this as some kind of moral indictment against the U.S. and/or Israel, despite the fact that the residents reported no one is even allowed to visit that site or see what happened or how extensive the damage is. No one has seen the photos of the victims. No one has received any information whatsoever other than what's in the regime's media, which is known for lying. So before you jump on these wild stories that we're hearing, consider the source. In this case, the ugly source. The bad story this week is the Iranian ballistic missile attack targeting Beit Shemesh. And yes, while we've seen dozens of missile attacks, including here on Tel Aviv, this was a harsh reminder that no defense is hermetic. On Sunday, the Islamic Republic and its military apparatus, including the IRGC, not only fired at Oman, Jordan, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they also fired at residential areas in Israel, including Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Now, not only did a missile fall near the old city of Jerusalem, supposedly holy to the mullahs, right? But also it hit a shelter in Beit Shemesh, suffering a direct hit in which 9 were killed and 30 injured in the largest casualty missile strike we've seen thus far. This war may be just, but it certainly still has its consequences. May the memories of the fallen be blessed. And finally, to close on a happy note, something I've waited years to say, Ali Khamenei, the Hitler of our time, the butcher of the Iranian people, is dead, thanks to the Israel Defense Forces. In the opening strikes of the war, the IDF eliminated 40 senior IRGC and regime officials, including Khamenei, as well as IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour and the Secretary of the National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani. He was wiped out in a massive strike on the Supreme Leader's compound in Tehran, and while the regime refused to admit Khamenei was eliminated for the entire day, IDF assessments proved he was taken out, and the regime finally admitted the next day. The precision and accuracy of the IDF has left the regime once again completely vulnerable, and this time, together with the Iranian people, we will push this genocidal dictatorship off the cliff. A free Iran is coming, and it's closer than ever. As always, we'll be back next week with more stories and updates from across the region and this ongoing war against the Islamic Republic. If you have a story for me, feel free to reach out on social media at Emily K. Schrader or Emily in Tel Aviv on Instagram. And until then, I'll see you next week on Access of Truth on JNS.